They say that in certain old archives, silence weighs more than absence itself. And this case, which occurred in the winter of 1887, is one of those in which the paper seems to tremble before being touched. If you can, comment on which city you are watching from and what time it is there now, for the record, as the chroniclers would say, who wrote down every detail before time erased them. The documents preserved in wooden drawers in the old county of Smoky Hollow describe, with almost uncomfortable precision, the geography of the region where it all began. A narrow valley surrounded by dense, foggy and little explored mountain ranges on the fringes of the Appalachians. The mountains, always covered in grey mist, held trails that few dared to cross. It was a place of suspicious inhabitants, silent farmers, and hunters who spoke more to trees than to men. The protagonist of this story, according to records, was Elias Turner, a 42-year-old experienced hunter, born and raised in that valley. Described in testimonies as a man of few words, Elias survived by trading furs and going on small hunting expeditions for neighboring families. There was no luxury in his life, only the harsh simplicity of the mountains, the smell of damp wood, and the solitude shared among the residents, who knew that there, each winter took more than it gave back. The archives mention that in October 1887, a strange movement began to attract attention in the community. A growing group of hunters, initially 6, then 12, until reaching 35 men, began to gather on the banks of the valley, preparing to enter an area known as Ridge Room, a narrow gorge between two rock walls where large moose had reportedly been sighted. Witnesses described the scene as normal, just another seasonal expedition. However, there was one detail that was repeated disturbingly in the official notes. No one seemed to know for sure who was organizing the incursion. Elias, although respected, was not a man who led such large groups. Other hunters, such as the Coleman brothers or old Fergus O'Halloran, also did not claim responsibility for coordinating it. Still, day after day, the number of participants increased without anyone taking responsibility. Residents said in statements taken years later that the men just went, as if a silent will hung in the air, moving them. The weather at the end of that autumn was described in local newspapers as particularly harsh, biting winds, low skies, and constant humidity that made your bones ache, but nothing that justified the atypical behavior of the 35 men. According to their wives, sisters, and children, who later gave their accounts, they all seemed distracted in the days leading up to their trip to the Ridge Room. Some would stand on the porch for long minutes, staring at the mountains. Others would walk around at night with no clear destination. One or two spoke of distant noises, though they never described them. Still, none of these observations alone would have suggested the tragedy that was to come. On the morning of November 6, 1887, before the sun broke through the fog, the group of 35 hunters crossed the main trail, carrying 2 days' worth of supplies. They were all seen climbing the ridge in slow single file, their kerosene lanterns swaying in the wind. Elias was one of the last to cross the valley line. His face, as described by a resident named Jonathan Brigg, looked too concentrated for a man accustomed to the woods. That was the last confirmed moment any of them were seen. What makes the case even more intriguing is a detail found in the county sheriff's report, written 3 weeks after the disappearance. There is no record of return footprints, no evidence of camping, no signs of confrontation or escape. Just a trail that ends abruptly at the end of Ridge Room, as if the hunters had simply dissolved into the cold. At the bottom of this report, preserved on a fragile sheet stained by moisture, there is a small note written in pencil, probably by the sheriff himself or an assistant. It is a minor detail, easily overlooked, but one that sets in motion the true mystery narrated in this file. The trail to the Ridge Room showed recent marks. However, they were not compatible with hunting boots. No other line explains what this meant. This is where this file begins to close in on itself, and where the silent investigation, which would last for decades, needs to be reconstructed with extreme care. Life in Smoky Hollow in 1887 followed a slow, harsh rhythm, Disciplined by the mountains. Before his disappearance, records show that Elias Turner's days were the same as those of so many men in the region. He woke up just before first light, when the fog still descended the slopes like a thick blanket, lit the wood stove, and prepared bitter coffee in a pot he had inherited from his father. Repetition was part of survival, and according to those who lived with him, Elias clung to this routine like someone holding onto a rope on a cliff. Among the documents preserved about his life, notes from a local merchant stand out, describing Elias's meticulous attitude when selling skins and choosing ammunition. The way he examined each cartridge, running his thumb over the metal as if he could sense its future performance. He was a man who trusted his senses, the smell of game, the rustling of leaves, the weight of the wind. He had never been known for impulsiveness, nor for getting involved in large groups, which makes his participation in the expedition even stranger. The days in the valley were marked by quiet poverty. Families lived in wooden cabins, often built by the residents themselves, where the sound of rain on the roof mingled with the distant sounds of forest animals. The women tended small gardens, sewed, raised chickens, and tried to keep the house warm. Children walked long distances to attend makeshift schools that often closed during the harsh winter. The county had only 2 commercial establishments, a small wooden church and a community barn used for occasional meetings. Despite the hard life, there was a kind of silent solidarity among the families. It was common for neighbors to leave dried meat on each other's porches during times of abundant hunting. Likewise, everyone helped each other when a resident fell ill or when snow prevented someone from working. This shared life meant that any abnormality was quickly noticed. The weeks leading up to the disappearance of the 35 hunters, however, were marked by a series of small episodes that, at the time, seemed irrelevant, but which, revisited decades later, arouse a peculiar discomfort in researchers. Records describe that on some nights, dogs barked in the direction of the mountains, as if they smelled something unknown. Elias, according to neighbors, was among those who went out to see what was disturbing the animals, but always returned without saying anything. Other men reported hearing a metallic echo in the distance, similar to tools hitting rocks. No one knew exactly when it started, nor who was the first to comment on it. They were just rumors, like so many that arise in isolated regions. There is also the belated testimony of a woman named Margaret Hale, who insisted that her husband, one of the missing hunters, had been waking up sweaty in the middle of the night, saying he dreamed of men walking in the mist, although he never detailed who they were or what they were doing. The preserved diaries describe nothing more than that, but the uncertain tone of her words remains recorded. Daily life went on, but the general feeling was that something was approaching. Elias, in particular, seemed more introspective in the days leading up to the expedition. He used to repair his traps in the open barn next to his house, a job he always did while whistling a short, almost imperceptible tune. However, in the last 2 weeks of October, according to reports collected decades later from the few survivors of that generation, the whistling ceased. Instead, Elias would stand still for long minutes, staring into the barn as if trying to remember something forgotten. Another point mentioned in the records is that the number of hunters interested in the ridge room was increasing without clear explanation. The valley had never gathered so many men for a single expedition, especially considering that the season was not yet officially the most favorable for big game hunting. There was no excitement among them. There was no enthusiasm or obvious economic motivation. It was as if each had decided on his own, but moved by the same silent impulse, unknown even to them. For many researchers, this phenomenon remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The testimonies show, however, that despite this strange behavior, daily life did not collapse. The women continued to milk cows, the young men chopped wood, the shepherds continued their small preaches. No explicit event pointed to danger. It was as if the entire valley was in a tense stillness, waiting for something to be revealed. On the eve of the expedition, Elias visited the county grocery store to buy flour, gunpowder, and kerosene. The shopkeeper who served him noted, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of intuition, that the hunter asked no questions about prices, made no comments about the weather, and exchanged not a single word beyond what was necessary. As he left, he glanced for a moment at the mountains and then made his way home with slow steps. This silent walk would later be remembered as the last moment when Elias seemed, in fact, like himself. What no resident could explain was why 35 men, many of them experienced, others simple farm workers with little affinity for hunting, agreed to leave for the ridge room at the same time. There was no clear leadership, no common goal, no financial reward to justify it. It was just a collective movement that no one admitted to initiating, and yet everyone went. The last night before the expedition was described as particularly cold. The wind blew through the trees with a sound that the residents called the Song of the Valley, a long lament that seemed to come from the rocks. In several houses, dogs howled. Elias lit his lamp, checked his weapons, and placed his heavy coat folded on the chair. But one detail, noted by his niece who lived with him, remains unexplained. He left the back door ajar, even though he knew the wind could extinguish the fire. A small gesture, but one that historians are still trying to interpret. When dawn arrived, nothing more could be done. The 35 men gathered, each bringing only the essentials. There were no speeches, no prolonged goodbyes, no sense of imminent danger. It was just another cold morning in the valley. But in the Turner family archives, there is a phrase written on a folded piece of paper, found years later among Elias's belongings, that completely changes the meaning of that departure. A short, almost illegible phrase recorded as if it were a reminder. If you hear it again, don't go. There is no date. There is no explanation. And no one knows for sure what Elias heard. At dawn on November 6, 1887, the fog descended so thickly over Smoky Hollow that the outlines of the houses seemed to dissolve into a cold white. It was one of those days when sound travels little, absorbed by the moisture in the air, as if every noise was swallowed before reaching the human ear. Still, some witnesses reported what they remember as a silent commotion. 35 men gathered on the main trail, adjusting backpacks, checking flashlights, and adjusting weapons, exchanging nothing more than brief gestures or scattered murmurs. The notes of the local pastor, who watched the group depart from afar, described the scene with a strangeness that the official investigation would only recognize years later. They all seemed to walk at the same pace, although no one was leading the way. Elias Turner, known for his reserved demeanor, was seen adjusting the straps of his backpack with ritualistic care, as if he felt that weight represented more than just hunting gear. The climb to the ridge would take about 2 hours, considering the uneven terrain and low visibility in the morning. Witnesses in the valley followed the group's progress as far as they could. Then the figures disappeared into the fog. Some described how, at the end of the visible trail, the glow of the flashlight seemed to diminish faster than it should, as if a larger shadow were absorbing the light. This detail, ignored in the police report, reappears insistently in the testimonies collected decades later. From this point on, the records become fragmented and need to be reconstructed through indirect accounts. Words from family members, remnants of notes found in abandoned shelters, and, above all, the incomplete report of a patrol sent days after the disappearance. According to county calculations, the hunters reached the entrance to the ridge room around noon. The rocky gorge, which gave the region its name, was narrow and deep, like the corridor of an ancient natural temple, where the echo of each step returned with a few seconds' delay. The wind there moved with a different force. It blew from the sides, not from above, causing the leaves to swirl in low spirals like small storms stuck to the ground. A farmer named Deacon Mullen, who had once accompanied Elias on a previous expedition, described Ridge Room as a place where the air seems too heavy for the lungs. Many hunters avoided that passage during the winter, as moisture accumulated between the stone walls, turning the ground into dark and treacherous mud. Still, the 35 men entered the natural corridor without hesitation. What is known about the following hours comes from fragments of observation. A handkerchief found stuck to a branch, tracks that suggested the group was slowing down, boot marks that gradually changed direction, as if the men were beginning to spread out. None of this, however, indicates purpose or disorder. On the contrary, it seemed that each deviation was intentional, even if there was no apparent reason for it. There is one particularly significant detail in the deputy's report. The boot prints found at the beginning of the corridor were deep, firm, consistent with men walking with heavy equipment. However, the further the patrol advanced into the ridge room, the shallower the marks became, as if the footsteps lost weight. One of the volunteers who participated in the search insisted years later that some footprints seemed too light to belong to hunters carrying backpacks. The sheriff ignored this observation at the time, treating it as an exaggeration. By around 3 p.m., it is estimated that the group had reached the narrowest part of the corridor. This section, informally known as Narrow Bend, was feared by locals. There was no direct light there. The walls sloped inward, filtering the sun until it became an opaque glow. The air was cold, still, with no sign of life. Reports describe that the patrol found, at this point, a small piece of torn cloth, part of a dark wool coat. It was the only material trace directly linked to the group. Night was falling early in the early winter. The wind, which had been blowing intermittently throughout the day, became steady and deep, emitting a sound that chroniclers called a continuous blow, similar to the sound of air passing through a metal flute. Some believed it was just wind currents trapped between the rocks. Others claimed with discomfort that they were certain they had heard something else, like distant voices swallowed by the echo. This is the last plausible information before complete absence. According to county calculations, the 35 men should have set up camp before nightfall, probably in some open stretch after Narrow Bend, where there was enough space for campfires. But when the patrol searched the area days later, they found no sign of a camp, no fire marks, food scraps, broken branches, nothing. The evidence suggested that the group had not stopped, or if they had stopped, they had left no trace. The valley residents began to wonder about the delay on the second day. On expeditions of this size, there was always someone who returned early or sent messages by courier. This time, there was no movement at all. At the end of the second night, the women lit lamps on their porches, a common habit when their husbands were delayed longer than expected, but the darkness of the mountain remained impenetrable. On the third day, the sheriff organized the first official patrol. There were 8 experienced men, including Jonathan Brigg, the last to see Elias before departure. The patrol advanced slowly along the main trail, following the tracks left by the 35 hunters. The first sections contained clear but disorganized marks, typical signs of large groups walking on wet ground. However, after about 40 minutes of walking, the tracks began to become too uniform, as if all the men had synchronized their steps. The sheriff's record describes this as an abnormal rhythmic pattern. When the patrol reached the entrance to the ridge room, the sun was already low and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Still, they pressed on. Reports collected later reveal the collective unease that accompanied them at that moment. One of the volunteers mentioned, "It was like entering a hallway where no one was supposed to speak." Another said he felt his stomach rise, as if his body identified danger before his mind did. About 50 meters into the gorge, something completely changed the course of the search. The boot prints disappeared. They didn't diminish. They didn't spread out. They simply vanished from one point to the next, as if from then on the men had stopped touching the ground. The police chief found no plausible explanation for this at the time and simply noted, "Trail interrupted for no apparent reason." Further on, the patrol found another trace, a fallen lamp with the glass intact, but no sign of soot. It was as if it had never been used. The object was identified as belonging to one of the Coleman brothers, but there was no indication why it was there, alone, in the center of the corridor. From that point on, the silence became almost physical. Nothing moved. There were no animal sounds, nor did the wind seem to reach that part of the mountain. The group advanced cautiously, fearing they would find bodies, but found only emptiness. And then came the most disturbing discovery of the entire mission. In the final section of the ridge room, where the walls open onto a narrow plateau, there was a set of marks on the ground, deep and parallel, as if something heavy had been dragged. But the drag did not lead into the forest. It led to the rock wall itself. The deputy described the phenomenon with uncomfortable precision. The marks indicate that the weight disappears upon touching the surface of the rock, as if there were nothing beyond that point. This excerpt from the report was underlined decades later by a researcher who wrote in the margin, "Impossible to ignore." No other traces were found that night. No tools, no pieces of clothing, no bodies. But on the patrol's return, something caught the attention of everyone present. Shortly before leaving the ridge room, one of the men, the youngest of the team, claimed to have heard something behind them, a faint sound, similar to footsteps. They weren't human, he said. They were footsteps of someone following the same cadence they found in the footprints. The sheriff ordered absolute silence. The sound did not repeat itself. When the patrol returned to the valley, it was late at night. The lamps remained lit on the porch of each house. Families waited for news. None could be given. The last entry of that day, written by the sheriff in his personal notebook, remains to this day the most disconcerting fragment of the entire historical archive. The trail ends where the mountain begins, but something walked behind us as we left. The news of the disappearance spread through Smoky Hollow with the silent speed typical of tragedies that no one dares to mention aloud. The morning after the patrol returned, the houses woke up with their doors ajar, lamps still lit, and women standing on their porches, waiting for figures who would never return along the mountain paths. There was no fuss, no shouting, just a heaviness in the air, as if the entire valley had instinctively understood that something definitive had happened. The sheriff called for a second search mission, this time larger, consisting of 16 men. Some were direct relatives of the missing, others were neighbors who felt a moral obligation to help. They left before dawn, taking provisions for 2 days. In the preserved documents, the atmosphere of tension that accompanied this new team is evident. Each volunteer was aware that they were not just looking for lost hunters, they were looking for an explanation that would justify the complete absence of traces. The second group followed the same path, marked again the sections where the tracks disappeared, and returned to the ridge room. They found the same motionless landscape, the same damp walls, the same wind trapped between the rocks. Nothing seemed to have changed since the last report. However, a new and revealing detail emerged this time. At the entrance to Narrow Bend, one of the volunteers found a small metal object partially buried in the mud. It was the clasp of a backpack, of the type used by Elias Turner. The clasp was bent, as if it had been torn off with force. The deputy noted in the official report that this indicated a possible fall or impact against the rock wall. This interpretation, though simple, would be decisive for the conclusion that would come weeks later. As they advanced to the final plateau of the ridge room, the men noticed something that the first patrol had not noticed. There were marks on the stone wall, at the height of an adult man's chest, as if someone had tried to support or propel themselves. The marks were not deep, just wide, parallel scratches, like open hands sliding across the damp surface. This led the deputy to consider a previously overlooked hypothesis, the possibility that part of the group had tried to climb the rock wall, believing that the path above would offer a safer exit from the narrow gorge. This theory gained strength when one of the men noticed broken vegetation at the top of the rock, broken branches, trampled leaves, marks of disturbed soil. It was discrete evidence, but enough to change the entire understanding of the case. The new interpretation became the following. The hunters may have split up, with some continuing along the ridge room and others attempting to climb, perhaps fleeing from something they interpreted as imminent danger, an animal, a landslide, or even extreme weather conditions. This possibility was never mentioned in popular rumors, but it appears highlighted in red in the expanded report written by the sheriff himself 2 months later. Meanwhile, in the valley, the absence of the men began to change the dynamics of the community. Entire families lost their breadwinners. The shops were empty. The local pastor began holding nightly meetings at the church, where residents talked in hushed tones, exchanging impressions about what might have happened. Preserved testimonies show that many believed that some kind of large animal had surprised the group, forcing them to disperse. Others mentioned the possibility that a sudden snowstorm had trapped the men in the ridge room, forcing them to seek alternative routes. But none of these theories explained the absence of traces. As the weeks passed, a steady stream of rumors began to circulate. Some said they had seen lights on the mountain. Others claimed to have heard screams in the middle of the night, although none of these reports were confirmed. One of the most sensitive testimonies was that of Margaret Hale, who insisted that her husband had left verbal clues in the days leading up to the expedition, as if he had a premonition. She told the sheriff that on the last night before the expedition, her husband had stood at the door for several minutes, staring into the darkness, muttering, "If it happens again, I'll follow the others." The investigations never discovered what "again" meant. The most solid and most human revelation in the case, however, came not from rumors, but from a letter. 3 weeks after the disappearance, Elias's brother, who lived in a neighboring county, presented the authorities with an envelope he had found among the Turner family's old belongings. The letter, dated months earlier, was written by Elias himself. The text was brief and contained only 3 important elements. Elias described hearing a sound that repeats itself every night, coming from the throat of the mountain. He claimed to believe that this sound was caused by some movement of rocks or underground flow. At the end, he wrote the phrase that had been found loose in his pocket days before the expedition: "If you hear it again, don't go." This letter completely changed the course of the investigation. For the first time, a plausible scenario gained traction. Elias and the other hunters may have interpreted a natural but unusual sound as a sign of danger, leading them to venture deeper into the ridge room in search of its source. This search, coupled with the adverse conditions of the season, could have caused part of the group to become disoriented, dividing them between those who tried to climb the wall and those who continued onward. A second revelation emerged when modern researchers reviewed topographical reports of the region. The ridge room was known, even in the 19th century, for harboring narrow and unstable underground crevices, some deep enough to hide rocks, branches, animals, or, tragically, people. This information, absent from reports at the time, offers a logical, albeit grim, conclusion to the case. The hunters may have been victims of sudden collapses in the terrain, falling into cavities that were never found. Still, the most delicate part of the investigation remained unanswered. Why would 35 experienced men, accustomed to the mountains, go to the same place on the same day, without a defined leader? This question runs through all the archives, without exception. And there is one last detail, recorded by one of the men from the second patrol, which rarely appears in popular versions of the case. In his written statement, he states that at the top of the rock where broken branches were found, there was something strange. Fresh footprints, but only one pair, as if only one man had reached the top. And according to him, the footprints went to the edge of the cliff and stopped there. No name was associated with these footprints. No other evidence was found above the ridge room, but the researcher who reviewed the files 50 years later wrote, in careful handwriting, a note next to that paragraph. If someone reached the top, why didn't they come down? Decades later, when the Smoky Hollow files had yellowed and time had turned the names of the 35 hunters into echoes of a distant past, historians who revisited the case noticed something that no investigation at the time had been able to see. The disappearance was not just a local tragedy, but a fragment of the human condition itself, in the face of the unknown. The absence of answers was not a flaw in the archive. It was an integral part of it. The mountains surrounding the ridge room remain there, immobile and indifferent, as they were in the winter of 1887. The wind that blows through the rocky gorge sounds much the same. Modern researchers who have visited the area report that the feeling of being in that narrow corridor is similar to entering a place where time stands still, where everything that happened there remains suspended, awaiting the return of those who never came back. As the decades passed, the valley changed. Many families left Smoky Hollow. Others were forced to start from scratch after losing their breadwinners. The grocery store closed, the community barn was used only sporadically, and the church, which once pulsed with humble life, became silent. The community that existed in 1887 did not fully survive the disappearance, not because the men were gone, but because what was left behind was an emptiness that could not be filled. Records show that in the years that followed, there were attempts to establish a definitive narrative about what happened. Some authorities defended the idea of a geological collapse. Others insisted on a dispersion caused by sudden storms. There were even those who suggested internal conflicts among the hunters, although no testimony supported this hypothesis. Each theory, however, died in the face of the same unshakable fact. No bodies were found, no tools, no bones, nothing. Some researchers believe that the most likely explanation is also the most modest, a combination of dangerous terrain, severe weather, and human decisions made under pressure. The mountain, with its rugged geology, could easily have concealed entire groups. A miscalculated fall, coupled with extreme isolation, would have been enough to prevent any rescue attempt. But even so, the question that still troubles serious scholars today remains: why did they all walk toward the mountain at the same time? This is the part that no report can resolve. Upon revisiting letters, diaries, and testimonies, some historians note subtle patterns, repeated mentions of distant echoes, metallic noises, vibrations in the ground, sudden changes in behavior among men accustomed to the silence of the woods. These details, when analyzed in isolation, prove nothing. But taken together, they form a discrete mosaic of prior unease. Something that preceded the departure. Something that may have been interpreted as a sign. Not a supernatural sign, but a natural, real stimulus, yet not fully understood. There are geological records indicating that during that period, mountainous regions of the Appalachians experienced small underground movements, producing sounds that residents described as slow hammering, or long voices from deep within the rock. These phenomena are rare but documented, and for men who lived by instinct and reading nature, any change in the mountain's behavior could be interpreted as a warning. Perhaps they went to the ridge room to understand what or who was disturbing the regularity of the valley. Perhaps they believed they were following others, or that they needed to warn someone. We will never know. What remains, even today, is a kind of persistent silence that covers the case. Researchers who have examined the archives note that even the most detailed accounts contain pauses, interrupted sentences, incomplete descriptions, hesitations that suggest that not all residents wanted to revisit the memory of it, as if they feared that, by speaking, something would be awakened in the mountain. And yet, among all the fragments of this historical archive, there is one record that stands out for its simplicity. It is a statement given by Jonathan Brigg, now elderly, decades after seeing Elias leave. He described in a low voice the moment when the hunter crossed the last bend before disappearing into the fog. "He looked back for a moment," said Jonathan, not as if saying goodbye, but as if realizing that something had been left behind. As if something were coming after him. This phrase, preserved in shaky handwriting, has become a symbol of the aura surrounding the case. Scholars know that complete answers will never be found. The mountain does not give back what it takes. And yet, the disappearance of the 35 hunters continues to be researched, retold, and debated because, in some way, it reveals more about who we are than about what happened. Deep down, the mystery of Smoky Hollow is not just about men who entered the ridge room and did not return. It is about human frailty in the face of the incomprehensible. It is about footsteps that cease without warning. It is about decisions made in the solitude of the mind. It is about what silence can carry. Today, when historians visit the valley to analyze the terrain, they notice something curious. The echo inside the ridge room remains irregular. It does not always respond. Sometimes it returns weakly, other times it does not return at all. And on certain mornings, according to some reports, it does not return at all, as if the sound were absorbed by something beyond the rock. Maybe it's just a geological feature. Maybe it's just the way the mountain breathes. Or maybe it's just a silent reminder that there, in 1887, 35 men walked into the fog, and no trail came after them. And every time the echo doesn't come back, someone remembers.